It was the kind of house that seemed perfect at first, old but charming, with a big backyard and enough space for the family to grow. The kind of place where everything looked picturesque during the day, but something changed when night fell. For Emily and her younger brother, the basement was a place they learned to avoid, even as kids. Their parents always told them not to go down there unless it was absolutely necessary. They never explained why, but it became one of those rules you don't question. Everyone else was afraid of the basement, too. When Emily was 16, her parents decided to go away for the weekend, leaving her home alone with her brother. She had always felt uneasy in that house, but this weekend, something felt different. That night after dinner, Emily went upstairs to her room. Her brother already lost in a video game downstairs. The house was silent, too silent. Then she heard it, slow footsteps creaking across the floor below her. Not the regular sounds of the house settling. These were deliberate, as though someone was moving around, just beneath her. She froze. Her brother hadn't moved. Tentatively, Emily crept to the stairs, listening for a moment longer. The sound stopped. She couldn't ignore the feeling crawling up her spine now. Her heart pounded. Every fiber of her being screamed that she should just leave, get out of the house. But it was too late to call her parents. It was too late for anything. She decided to check on her brother, hoping it was just her imagination running wild. When she stepped into the living room, the air felt heavier, colder. The basement door was slightly ajar. It had never been like that before. Normally it was shut tight, even when her parents were home. With a mix of curiosity and dread, Emily approached the door, peeking through the crack. Her brother wasn't in sight. The smell of mildew and something rotting lingered in the air, much stronger than it had been before. She stepped closer, heart racing. The basement stairs were pitch black, the faint flicker of a dying light bulb casting shadows across the walls. "Jason?" she called softly, but there was no answer. Her brother was nowhere in sight. She looked around for a moment, then heard the unmistakable sound of a door opening below her. The basement door. But it wasn't the creak of the door in the hallway. It was coming from deeper inside the basement. A slow, agonizingly deliberate sound. She grabbed the flashlight from the table by the door and stepped inside, the beam cutting through the darkness. Her feet shuffled across the cold floor as she descended, her heartbeat thumping louder in her chest than the creak of the stairs beneath her. At the bottom of the stairs, the air felt almost suffocating. It was the kind of dense, heavy silence that made it feel as though someone or something was watching. The flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. And that's when she saw it. A trail of dark smudges leading to the far corner of the basement. The concrete floor was cracked, but there were more stains, thick and dark, as though something had been dragged through the dirt. Emily's throat tightened as the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She couldn't tell whether the stains were from paint, mud, or something far worse. She followed the trail hesitantly, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The light illuminated a small, old-fashioned door in the corner. She had never noticed it before, and she had spent years in that house. The door was barely large enough for a grown person to fit through, and the wood was chipped and warped as if it had been used and abused for decades. The closer she got, the more she felt her stomach churn. Without thinking, she reached for the handle, her fingers trembling. As she pulled the door open, a burst of cold air hit her face, carrying the smell of decay and rot. The narrow space was filled with shadows, but there was something else, a soft, rhythmic tapping like nails against wood. It was coming from inside. With dread swelling in her chest, Emily stepped through the door. Her flashlight flickered again, and then she saw it. Jason. Or at least, it looked like him. His body was twisted in an unnatural way, kneeling in the corner of the tiny, cramped room. His eyes were wide open, staring vacantly at the wall. His hands were curled unnaturally, fingers bent backward at impossible angles, tapping against the floor in a slow, steady rhythm. She gasped, and that was enough to break the eerie stillness. Jason's head snapped around, his eyes glowing with an unsettling, empty void. His mouth was wide open, but no sound came out. It was as though something was controlling him, forcing him to behave in a way that wasn't his own. And just before she could react, the door slammed shut behind her, plunging her into complete darkness. Panic flooded her senses as she screamed, desperately trying to reach the door, but her hands hit cold stone instead. She heard Jason, no, whatever it was that used to be Jason, laughing. It wasn't his voice. It was deeper, more guttural, like something had taken root in his body, using him as a vessel. Emily scrambled against the walls, her heart beating in her throat. The door opened again, and she saw it, a shape, hunched and twisted, its shadow tall and long against the walls. The air was suffocating now. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All she could do was run. She bolted up the stairs, but the house felt endless now, distorted, its walls closing in on her. And as she reached the front door, it swung open, revealing the same basement door standing in front of her. She gasped, choking on the stale air, but there was no escape. The last thing she saw before the darkness overtook her were the eyes of her brother, or whatever was left of him, staring back at her from the depths of the house.
Story number 2.
There was a house at the end of a quiet street that no one dared to go near. The locals called it the Black House because, despite being a large, well-built structure, it was covered in a thick layer of black soot that seemed to seep into the bricks themselves. People had heard rumors for years, whispers of strange happenings, of lights flickering in the windows at night, and of an oppressive, unsettling feeling around the property. But it wasn't until the Johnson family moved in that things truly started to unravel. The Johnsons were new to the area, excited to start fresh in a place where they thought they could escape the busy city life. But from the moment they stepped inside, something felt wrong. It was an old house, with creaky floors and dust thick enough to make every breath feel like a struggle. But it wasn't just the age that made it eerie. It was the silence. The house seemed to absorb sound, and at night, when the wind howled outside, it felt as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. At first, the family ignored the strange sounds. The children, Sarah and Ben, would hear what sounded like whispers late at night, soft, indecipherable voices from the walls. But when they told their parents, the couple dismissed it as the house settling. After all, old houses made noise, but that was before they found the door in the attic. It was a small, hidden door tucked behind an old bookshelf that was too heavy for Sarah to move on her own. The door was locked, but after much struggle, the family managed to break it open. Inside, they found nothing but an empty room, covered in dust and cobwebs. However, in the far corner, there was something that didn't belong. A mirror, tall and ornate, framed in black iron. The mirror was beautiful, but it was unlike anything they had ever seen. It wasn't like any mirror they had in the house. It felt wrong, as if it wasn't meant to be there. The reflection it gave wasn't quite right. The family could never look into it for too long without feeling dizzy or nauseous. Sarah and Ben, drawn to it despite their unease, would often stare into it for minutes on end, feeling as though it was staring back at them, showing them things they couldn't understand. One evening, after a particularly stormy night, the family heard the sounds again, louder this time, coming from the attic. They tried to ignore it, but the air grew thick, and an oppressive feeling settled over the house. It was as though the house itself was alive, shifting, watching. The whispers turned into words, and when the family finally gathered the courage to climb into the attic, they found the mirror glowing faintly in the darkness. Sarah reached out to touch it, her fingers brushing against the cold glass, and the room around her went dark. In the reflection, she didn't see herself anymore. She saw a twisted version of her face, eyes sunken deep, mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, but it was moving. It was alive. Her own reflection reached out to her, its hand pressing against the glass from the other side. Panicked, Sarah stepped back, but the reflection didn't stop. It smiled at her with a wicked gleam in its eyes, and then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The mirror was just a mirror again, but something had changed. From that moment on, the house wasn't the same. The whispers became louder, more urgent. The air turned cold, and no matter what they did, the family couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At night, Sarah would often hear her name whispered from the shadows, but when she turned on the light, no one was there. One night, Ben went missing. He had been playing in the backyard when he disappeared. No one heard him scream. No one saw anything unusual. He was just gone. The police scoured the area, but there was no trace of him. It was as though he had simply vanished from the face of the earth. But Sarah knew where he was. The mirror. With trembling hands, she went up to the attic alone. When she gazed into the mirror this time, it wasn't just her reflection staring back. Ben's face appeared, twisted in agony, his eyes wide with terror. His hands pressed against the glass as if begging for help. Sarah reached out, but the glass was cold, and there was nothing she could do. As the days passed, the family slowly began to unravel. The house grew colder, darker, and more oppressive. Sarah and her parents, once so full of hope, were slowly consumed by the fear of the mirror, of the house that seemed to be alive with something ancient and malevolent. It wasn't long before they all disappeared, one by one. Sarah's parents vanished without a trace. Some say they were driven mad by the whispers, by the reflection, by whatever had been waiting for them in that dark, hidden attic. As for Sarah, she was never seen again. But every so often, late at night, the faint glow of the mirror can still be seen through the attic window. And those brave enough to venture too close say they can hear the faint sound of whispers on the wind. Whispers that sound like Sarah calling for help. No one dares to go near the Black House anymore. It sits at the end of the street, waiting for the next family to move in, to be drawn into its horrors, to become just another part of the house's twisted history.
Story number 3.
The old farmhouse had been abandoned for years. No one remembered when it had last been lived in, but every time someone passed it, they could feel its weight, as if it were watching them, waiting. The local children told stories of strange noises coming from the house at night. Soft crying, the creak of footsteps on the old wooden floors, whispers that would fade when anyone tried to get closer. Most people avoided the house, but there was one man, Thomas, who didn't believe in ghost stories. He just moved to town, and when he saw the house for sale, he thought it would be perfect for his family. It was cheap, old but sturdy, and in a quiet area away from the city noise. He didn't care that it had been empty for so long. He figured a little cleaning and repairs would be all it needed. His wife, Kate, wasn't as sure about it, but Thomas convinced her that it would be a fresh start for their family. Their son, Jeremy, was young enough not to care about the house's eerie history, and so they moved in. At first, things seemed fine. The house was dusty, but it was spacious and had a lot of charm. However, strange things started to happen almost immediately. At night, Kate would hear faint whispers coming from the attic, a soft voice calling her name, just barely above the hum of the wind outside. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but after a few nights of hearing it, she woke Thomas, asking if he had heard anything. He hadn't, of course, and told her it was probably just the house settling. One night, Jeremy came running into their room, wide-eyed and terrified. "There's someone in my room," he said, shaking uncontrollably. He said he'd been lying in bed when he saw a figure standing in the corner, tall and shadowed, with long, matted hair hanging down its face. Jeremy had run out of the room before the thing could do anything, but the terror in his eyes was real. Thomas, still dismissing it as a nightmare, went into the boy's room to investigate. The room was empty. There were no signs of anyone having been there, and the only thing out of place was a small wooden rocking chair in the corner. It creaked softly, as if it had been rocking back and forth on its own. But things escalated quickly. Over the next few days, Kate began noticing odd occurrences. Objects moved when no one was around, doors that had been closed were found wide open, and she began waking up in the middle of the night, hearing the same whispering voices, now louder, more urgent. The voices seemed to be coming from the attic again. But when she went to check, the attic was always empty, dust-covered and silent, as though nothing had disturbed it for years. Desperate, she asked Thomas to bring in a local historian to learn more about the house. The historian, an elderly man named Mr. Hayes, came by the next day, curious about the property. When he entered the house, he immediately grew tense, his eyes darting around as if he could sense something the others couldn't. He didn't speak for a long time. Finally, after much prodding, Mr. Hayes told them about the house's tragic past. Years ago, the house had belonged to a family, the Duncans. They had a young daughter, Emma, who had disappeared one night. No one ever found her, but rumors spread that her parents had been involved in her death. People said that Emma's spirit had never left and that she had been seeking vengeance on the house for years. Thomas was skeptical at first, but Mr. Hayes' words began to resonate as strange things continued to happen. One night, Kate woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of children's laughter echoing through the house. She rushed to Jeremy's room to find him asleep, but standing next to his bed was a tall, shadowy figure. It had long, thin arms, and its face was hidden beneath a mass of tangled hair. Its eyes, however, glowed faintly in the darkness, a sickly greenish hue that seemed to pierce her soul. Terrified, Kate screamed, but the figure did not move. It only stood there, staring at her. The air grew thick, and the temperature in the room dropped to an almost unbearable chill. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving only the faint smell of decay behind. Kate tried to convince Thomas they needed to leave the house, but he refused. He didn't believe in ghosts, and he was convinced that something else was going on. But the more time they spent in the house, the more its hold on them grew. One evening, after Jeremy went missing, Thomas finally began to understand. The boy had been playing outside when he disappeared. The house was quiet, too quiet, no signs of struggle, no clues. Kate had searched the entire house, screaming for him, but there was no trace. That's when the whispering started again. Desperate, Thomas went up to the attic to investigate. The door was locked, but the moment he forced it open, he was hit with a wave of cold air that seemed to pull at him. Inside, the attic was vast and empty, except for one thing, a small wooden chest tucked into the far corner. It was old, dust-covered, and locked with a rusted metal clasp. With shaking hands, Thomas opened the chest, and inside, he found something that made his blood run cold. Old, yellowed photographs, one of which showed a girl with matted hair and hollow eyes. Emma Duncan. He stared at the picture, and that's when he heard it, a soft faint he could barely hear it, whispering his name. He turned, and there she was, the figure of Emma, standing in the shadows, her face twisted in agony. "Help me," she whispered, reaching toward him with thin, bony fingers. "Help me, or she'll never leave." Suddenly, the house shook. The walls groaned, the windows rattled, and Thomas felt as though the entire house was coming alive. The ground beneath him seemed to tremble with anger. The whispers grew louder, and the temperature plummeted. Cold hands brushed against his skin, pulling at him. And then, in a flash of terror, Thomas realized that the house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. The spirit of Emma Duncan, tormented by her tragic death, had been using the house as a vessel, feeding off the fear of anyone who dared to stay. The last thing he saw before everything went black were those glowing green eyes, watching, waiting. When the police arrived, they found the house empty, just like it had always been. The Johnsons were gone without a trace, as though they had never existed. But every so often, when the wind is right, you can hear the faint whisper of a girl calling for help, lost forever in the depths of the Black House.